misandry in history. You know, normally, I hate to say this, but normally you actually have to look in little nooks and crannies. You have to word things right. You have to know what you're looking for. And then, other times, the media does it for you without even knowing it. When during my attempt at cooling off and trying to get my head back on straight and trying to become less militant, as I was slowly becoming, as a result of some of my research and readings, experiences. As I was trying to calm down, I decided to take in a series a friend of mine had emailed me about. And I'm always interested in history. I'm always interested in perspectives of other people. Knowing what I know, knowing archaeology, in, well, certain things, not in every form or in extreme detail, and field experience or anything like that, but I read reports. I try to keep up on what's going on. But in this case, this was actually really interesting to me. Here in the States, we had one of our cable channels to go and do an entire series on the history of the United States. They had a couple of them, and they attempted to tell the story in a number of different ways of how this country was formed, founded. They tried to look at some of the good and the bad. They overemphasized some of the bad. Some of the other bad stuff they didn't even mention. So you can imagine it. I don't expect a documentary on Nat Geo or something to be Rhodes Scholar worthy. It's just it's not something to ever be expected. But I was told about this series titled The British. That's the title of the series. And within it, I found a lot of things interesting as to what happened during the Great Fire of London, some of the other occurrences, except one thing I noticed. And I'm not going to give away the whole series because I recommend, I'll be honest, I like it, I recommend it, go watch it. But what I will say is, in nearly every episode, which each episode tends to focus on a specific period of time. In each episode, there's an example of cultural misandry within the British culture. At nearly every stage. One of them, I'm not going to say what episode it's in. One of them, this is after the Industrial Revolution. In one of them, there's a labor dispute, and these two women go and start this huge labor riot. And I mean, I can understand why they did. Conditions were deplorable, right? But these two women started this riot. Now, they, as women, could not be held responsible for their actions. However, so these women in their 20s were not responsible effectively for their actions. And except a 13-year-old boy who was working that night, sweeping according to all the actual records, his only crime was being present at work that night. He was hanged for their crime. He was hanged. Now, this story was obviously very important to me. Not so much from the story itself. I understand that kind of stuff happened. But it was the comments afterwards. No mention about how this young boy was hanged for effectively being at the right place at his job at the wrong time. No mention about how he got shafted, or how these women effectively just skirted along, effectively based on their gender. No mention to that. All you hear from the female commentary, one of the people telling the story, is how horrible it was to hang a 13-year-old. Now I know you could look at it saying, well, I'm looking really deep into this, too extensively deep, some might say. And to be honest, you could be right. However, throughout this series, you can see how women as a whole are put on this pedestal to effectively each one is supposed to be treated as a queen within the society itself. There are certain rules to try and maintain certain control, because if you look at it carefully, you can tell that, especially in the Victorian era, some things were starting to be realized as women were coming out into the workforce. By the Edwardian era, men were starting to figure out, that's not a good idea. As these women start to realize that they are powerful in groups, because they can affect what happens in the home, which affects the person that's making the money. And if he wants to continue making his money and not have her take all of his stuff, yes, this was even a problem back then. If he effectively just had to bend to her will. What we're going through is nothing new. The Western world has been experiencing these things with females over a prolonged period of time. Another series that I came across, and I will be leaving links to both of these. Once again, I recommend Linux. If you don't have a guest account, use a throwaway. If you're using Windows, please go and download VirtualBox and install Ubuntu. Keep the viruses out of your computer. The only real viruses that affect Linux, at least for most of my experience, they have been Java-based viruses, because everything uses Java. So just be mindful of that. Well, there's another one on the, I think it's called The History of Shopping. You will find this one interesting. This one is very telling, and to my knowledge, the series is not over yet. Within this, it actually kind of explains how women have become this unholy plague that is swept across the planet. Advertising. Department stores. I'm not kidding. Watch them. You can argue with them. Some of what they say makes sense. Some of it doesn't. Well, the same could be said along with another show that I personally like, How Beer Saved the World. If you like, I will put that down in the in the description box too. That one is just, that's just a, Speaking of which, that just is kind of making me thirsty. But anyways, 10 minutes. But with this, it shows how women were turned into this cash flow enabler. It was shown how, while thanks to these stores and their types of advertising and the way they were advertised, what they advertised, and the methods that were used, many of which are being used today, were used on these stay-at-home women. Within these women, what it was that these women were expected to go shopping during the day while their husbands were out and their children were at school. They have all the free time at the house. The department stores were originally designed to help the burgeoning, brand new middle class that was slowly coming into existence. Prior to that, it didn't exist. Now, as a result of this burgeoning middle class, these women wanted to go and look good for each other. So these stores use advertisements and everything else to entice women to spend their husbands' money to compete amongst themselves, while their husbands go into debt and then are arrested and sent to debtor's prison for the spending habits of their wives. There is also the fact that a number of these department stores early on facilitated the another early form of the women's liberation movement. A lot of these problems we have currently are problems that result in part to this consumerism mentality. And it's not driven by need, it's driven by desire, by want, by emotion. And this essentially tells the story of how we have gotten to Sears and Macy's. Thank you. I'll be leaving some links down in there. Seriously, check them out and let me know. In every episode, I promise you, you will be finding examples of misandry throughout history, and usually the horrible consequences for men as a result. Well, thank you. Hopefully it was somewhat informative. Have a good day.